All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Hope you're all having a great first day of conference and a great day in general. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this session, Dr. Matthew Gordon. Dr. Gordon is a physicist, engineer, and the founder and executive director of Climate Tech Action Network, a 501c6 nonprofit that provides mentorship and resources to engineers, scientists, and entrepreneurs who are seeking to use their skills to help combat the climate crisis. He spent 5 years working in climate tech as a principal engineer at Kairos Aerospace, where he works on detecting and mitigating methane emissions from natural gas leaks in oil and gas industries. He received his AB in physics from Princeton and his doctorate in physics from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he specialized in single molecule imaging and spectroscopy. He spent 6 years as an early engineer at Palantir Technologies, working on a wide range of big data analysis challenges in law, finance, and global health. He's a dad to twin toddlers, and he dabbles his extra time in kinetic sculpture and fire art. And today, he'll be talking to us about the role of new technology in fighting climate change. To just let you know, we're going to have a Q&A session at the end. You can always send in questions via the Q&A tab through chat, or if you want to jump on stage in person, you can always raise your hand. We'll bring you on and you can ask a question. And with that, I would love to welcome Dr. Matthew Gordon for the session.
There we go. There's me. Hi. Thanks very much, Jeff. Let me get my slides up here. Oops, great. There we go. So thanks, welcome. I'm glad you're taking time to come talk about what I think is one of the most important topics, climate change. I think today is an auspicious day to talk about it. This is today's headlines. The Biden administration is calling for very sharp cuts to greenhouse gas emissions over the next 15 to 20 years. And that's really exciting. And I want to tell you a little bit about how I came to work in climate tech and what I think working in climate tech means and why it's important. And overall, how we think about the roles the technology plays in both the way it created the climate crisis and the ways that it can be used to address it. So I spent 10 years as an academic physicist. I was working on biological physics problems, doing advanced imaging and spectroscopy. And after a while, it was kind of time for a change, and I sort of pieced out across the street from Stanford over to Palo Alto, where there was a lot of interesting tech work going on. And eventually, a friend of mine and I went and started working at a new company called Kairos Aerospace. I was pretty well suited. We do spectroscopic imaging of hyperspectral imaging to detect methane emissions. You can see on the left there is our little pod, which we fly in airplanes to scan for methane. And we see natural gas emissions from oil and gas plants, and we can then use that information to help oil and gas producers prevent methane emissions. You may or may not be aware that methane accounts for about 15% of global climate forcing, and it's a very, very bad per pound climate pollutant. It's about 60 to 80 times worse than carbon dioxide. And we currently don't have great information about how much methane is out there, which is one of the reasons that we do this work. So since 2019, Kairos has done the equivalent of about taking 2 million cars off the road if you look at our climate impact. And I really love talking about this work. And in 2019, I went to PyCon, the Python Developers Conference, and I talked about the work that we were doing. And more than anything, the question I got from people was, how do we know if climate, like what can we do to help? I'm an engineer and I want to be able to help. And I was really kind of stumped at the time. I didn't know what the answer was. And I sort of directed people vaguely to like political action, calling your senator to talk about carbon credits and things like that. But it sort of haunted me that we had these engineers who really wanted to get involved and didn't know how. And so I founded the Climate Tech Action Network, which was an attempt to find a place where engineers and scientists who want to get involved in climate change can start to understand the range of problems that are out there, and also a place for us to advocate for the role of technology in fighting climate change. But it's led me to a lot of thinking about what is that role? Technology and industrialization is the source of climate change. We burn fossil fuels in order to generate most of the energy that we use. Technology is also the thing that's going to allow us to transition off of fossil fuels and other technologies that and processes that generate greenhouse gas emissions. And so, how do we know what the right technologies are? How do we know where to focus our energy? So with that question in mind, I want to lead you through a little bit of sort of the scale of the climate tech problem, and then talk a little bit about how to think through these questions about what's the scale of the problem and how do we think about it, and where technology plays a role. So if you take a look at this graph, you can see global primary energy consumption by source. And you can see here, there is over on the left, there's a little bar there that shows how much renewable energy, including nuclear, we were using in 2000, and a slight growth in that bar over on the right in what we were using in 2019. There has been quite a bit of growth in renewables, but you can see that the amount of energy that we need to actually replace with renewables is pretty big. The IPCC goal to get us to net zero by 2050 in order to forestall climate changes above 1.5 degrees C assumes that we will be able to get to net zero by 2050. Right now, the world consumes about 14,000 MTOE, which is millions of tons of oil equivalent, which is a way of measuring energy, like how much energy is in a ton of oil. So we use about 14,000 MTOE per year. And in 2018, we added about 100 MTOE of renewables. In order to get to net zero, we need to add about 1,000 MTOE a year over the next 10 years in order to get to 1.5 C. And one of the reasons those numbers don't seem to quite line up is because we actually have to do almost all of the work as quickly as possible in the next 10 years in order to forestall 1.5 degrees change. It looks slightly better if you look at the US. The green line there is renewable growth from 1950 to 2019, but there is still a lot of work to be done. And if we want to have that, we actually have to do more than replace half of that graph, because there's a lot of processes that we can't currently electrify, which means that we can't use renewable electrical energy to fix them. And so that's one of the things I'm going to talk about a little bit. But this gives you an idea of the scale of how much energy we actually need to create that is renewable and that is does not generate net carbon. I think more importantly, in some sense, is understanding the scale of the problem in terms of human lives. So on the left is Shanghai, and on the right is Calcutta. And you can see in red, these are areas that are expected to be underwater by 2050, if under sort of current assumptions, by 2100, sorry, affecting 200 to 300 million people. These places would be under high tide right now. We would expect to see water shortages affecting 1 to 4 billion people. 20 million people have already been displaced by climate change. Places like Yemen is one of the best examples where we see a lot of internal conflict and migration due to drought and food shortage. And you would expect to see an additional 100 to 200 million people by 2100 under the current conditions. It's difficult to wrap your mind around the scale of that kind of human suffering, but I think it's important to try to understand how urgent the problem is. It's also important to consider how much of a shock this would have on the American economy. Just to think about it one way, the oil and gas industry directly employs about 1 million people in the US. And there's a $12 billion market for oil and gas infrastructure per year. There are 280 million cars on the road in the US, and we would have to almost entirely replace those to get to net zero. So that gives you a sense of like just the vast changes that would have to happen to our society in order to get there. And so the question is like, how do we get there? And I want to break down this question into three sort of concurrent ways that people think about approaching climate change. And I don't know that this is a common way to look at this problem, but I think it's the one that I've started thinking about a lot. So the first one that people often think about is personal choice, like choosing how to commute to work and what kinds of products to use. The second is collective action, which is basically how we as a society agree to regulate and pass laws. And the third is technological improvement. Can we create processes and products that that emit less carbon? And I want to talk about each of these three in turn. And the first thing that I want to do is unfortunately blow up your ideas about the role of personal choice in climate change. People think a lot about like their personal climate footprint and their personal carbon footprint. And so if you look at, say, like the top three climate mitigation strategies that are talked about in the media, those are like driving a hybrid car, washing your clothes on cold water, and recycling. And those have modest, half to a quarter ton per year per person impacts on the climate. Those, it turns out, are relatively easy things to do and also relatively ineffective. If you want to look at the things that are actually really effective that we almost never talk about, getting rid of your car is like a 10-fold better improvement over recycling. Choosing to not fly to Europe once a year, basically, is a huge carbon sink. And having one fewer child, depending on the way that you estimate it, can have up to 3 to 60 tons reduction of CO2. And I have kids, and I don't think that like talking about personal choice in this way, or what are very, very deeply and moral decisions, is the right way to go about fixing this problem. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And one of the main ones is that oftentimes when we think about personal choice, it's couched with a lot of unrecognized privilege, unidentified privilege. So let's talk about a simple one, which is like putting solar on the top of your house. That is a $15,000 to $25,000 capital outlay. Buying a Tesla, which has a frankly pretty modest climate impact because it depends on the mix of energy that's being used to recharge the Tesla, whether it's renewable or not. It's $35,000 capital outlay. Most people cannot afford those things. And placing the burden on people to make those choices, to engage in that kind of capital outlay, is simply taking the agency away from most of the people who have the ability to do things that can affect climate. If you want to look at like commute and getting rid of your car entirely, the way that we do housing and urban policy in this country has, by and large, driven housing prices way up in city centers. And it causes people who are lower income to have to engage in these sort of mega commutes to get to work. And telling people you should just drive less is not a viable solution for these people. And in particular, it's not a viable solution for the people who are the poorest and the most vulnerable among us. And so simply saying, we've got to fix it by choosing to drive less or choosing to install solar are not viable alternatives to actually working on some of the other possible ways. And then the last thing that I want to kind of point out is I think it's kind of intuitively obvious that like the last several years have pointed out to us that there are a lot of ways in which we as humans can help our fellow humans in really simple, tangible ways, like wearing a face mask when you go out to help prevent the spread of COVID, getting vaccinated. And even those two interventions can't get above about 60% adoption. by our fellow Americans. And so I don't think we have a lot of trust in our fellow Americans to just choose to do the right thing on their own. And I don't think we should. And I don't think we should be putting that responsibility on them. So that leaves the second choice, which is engaging in collective action. There isn't actually like a very clean separation between personal action and collective action, because collective action happens at like a whole bunch of different scales. It can start in small ways with your family, where you talk with people about your expectations and the choices they make. It can talk about your community and the ways that your community engages in its choosing about purchasing and its values. And it can go all the way up to obviously your municipal, state, and federal government and international governance like treaties. For the most part, I want to talk about government as our way of sort of thinking about collective action and our way of expressing our values and desires for how we are going to try and enforce overall group action on a particular goal. So rather than saying you should do this, the government has various ways of incentivizing people to do things. One of the most common ones is taxes. Carbon taxes, carbon credits for electric vehicles, things like this, where we basically say you have to pay if you're going to pollute. Regulation is another way. We can basically say people, it's illegal to, for instance, vent methane. And there's a lot of movement currently on sort of the methane mitigation front in terms of like, what should those regulations look like? And deregulation is in fact another way in which we can move forward with climate change. There are a lot of regulations around housing development and urban density that in fact work actively against creating higher density and better transit. And force us to build houses that were really designed for a fossil fuel era. And there are better ways to do that. And removing some of those regulations and replacing them with smarter, more climate forward regulatory regimes is another really important way that we can approach climate change. So all of those are sort of government interventions that we can collectively undertake through our political system. So it's really common to look at all that and to say, great, we can get there right now. In fact, we don't need any new technology. And to a certain extent, that is true. If you look at this chart, and I'm not going to go through the whole chart, but this is from one of my favorite organizations, Energy Innovation. And they show that like basically per sort of regulatory policy, how can we improve efficiency and remove CO2 emissions enough that we can get to the 1.5C pathway without requiring any new technologies? And this is true as far as it goes. But it's important to realize that there are actually limits on how much collective action we can do and how quickly. And I don't think it has escaped anybody's notice that the last year has been a huge failure of collective action on a number of fronts. We have seen people unwilling to see a peaceful transfer of power in our government. We see a lot of reaction against vaccines and enforcing mask mandates and having government mask mandates and vaccine mandates. And irrespective of the political truth of any of those things, such that we could talk about truth in such a context, it shows that there is a great deal of distrust in our institutions right now. And those institutions are the things that provide us with the information that we need in order to make those decisions. And if people don't trust those institutions, it is very difficult to take collective action. Another reason that it's really difficult for people to trust those institutions is because of epistemological drift. This is an interesting chart that shows basically study on climate advocates versus climate skeptics on social media and how they connect to each other. And you can see that this creates what people call these echo chambers or news bubbles, where people on different sides of this issue don't actually talk to each other. And in that case, it is really difficult to have a conversation where we can come to a place where we as a country or a world agree on what even the underlying issues are and the facts are. And so these are some of like the major barriers to collective action that we have to think about before we say we can do this all without technology, just by all agreeing on what to do. And so that brings me to the third question, like, what is the role of technology here? And I think one way to think about it is that moving us towards a zero carbon future requires a lot of input of money into R&D, into new assets, embodied emissions of current capital, which means basically like if you already have a car that burns fossil fuels, that's like a waste that has to sort of be like recycled into new things, and you have to buy a new car. And there's a lot of that out there. Remember, there's 280 million cars on the road. So for any given amount of money and collective action that we engage in, we can get a certain amount of CO2 reduction. But if we take that fulcrum and we move it to the right by investing in technology, what it means we can do is we can get more bang for our buck. We can get more CO2 reduction for less input of money and regulation. And that is where I think it is most important to focus our attention on in terms of what technology can do for us. And I think an important distinction is that when people talk about the role of technology in climate change, they often think of very whiz-bang, high-tech stuff like direct air capture, where we're going to pull carbon dioxide out of the air. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of direct air capture and negative emissions technologies. But there are a lot of what I think of as low tech or middle tech stuff that has to happen. And the reason for that is, as Mark Andreessen famously said, the world is being eaten by software. And more broadly, the world is run on technology. And we cannot change technology without adapting it. We cannot change the processes that we use without really investing in like middleware technology that helps us do things like run things more efficiently, figure out where to put our resources, figure out how to get the resources from point A to point B. All of those are relatively unsexy problems, and all of them need to be solved, and all of them involve investment in technology. So to the extent that it is true that we can follow that graph of improvements to make in order to get from point A to point B to 1.5 C and zero net emissions, those actually still do involve significant investments in technology across the board. So I'm going to talk for a little bit about what kinds of technologies I think are interesting to look at. And I'm going to also name a couple companies and organizations. I don't want this to be thought of as in any way, shape, or form an exhaustive list of companies or technologies. They happen to be ones that I'm familiar with. And specifically the companies are ones that I'm familiar with or have a lot of been in the news lately. But there is a vast array of companies working on these problems, and there are a lot of opportunities to go work on these problems. So in renewables, we need more renewables, we need more efficient renewables, and we need better processes for figuring out where to site them, how much power they're going to generate, and how to use them efficiently. So solar forecasting is one way that we can do that, and Open Climate Fix is creating a vast machine learning model, trying to figure out how can we better understand how much electricity we can expect to extract from a given solar installation. We want to be able to create lower cost solar installations. And so in addition to creating more efficient photovoltaic cells, there's a lot of nitty gritty that has to happen. Sunfolding is an interesting company that's trying to reconsider the ways in which we actually use like the underlying mechanisms to reposition solar cells in arrays, because doing solar tracking improves the efficiency by a huge amount. But those mechanisms are actually fragile and difficult, and they need to be replaced, and that increases the cost of ownership and the cost of operating these things. And then there's a whole array of renewable technologies that are still to some extent in their infancy. Geothermal has a lot of potential to make for much cheaper renewable energy, but there hasn't been a ton of movement on how we do geothermal. Fervo Energy is trying to use new technologies that have been made available through the oil and gas drilling technological boom due to fracking, and use those to figure out how we can better create more efficient geothermal, site geothermal better, and site it in more places. So another known issue with renewables is that they tend to be cyclic during the day. Wind and solar power being the two most obvious examples tend to operate when the sun is out and when it's windy. And in order to smooth out those those differences. Right now, people use what are called peaker plants, where when there's peak demand, people basically fire up natural gas generators. The other way to do this without using fossil fuels is to be able to store energy more efficiently. And unfortunately, batteries are actually quite bad at storing energy efficiently. They're heavy, they're expensive, and it's really difficult to store like industrial scale amounts of energy for like an entire city. There are companies working on various types of energy storage. Form Energy is very well known right now for having just received a big influx of cash, I think, from the Gates Foundation to develop advanced batteries with the specific intention of smoothing out supply demand curves in the grid. And smart grids are another really important way of thinking about this. Our grid technology is like from the 70s and 80s. It is ancient. Grids tend not to be interconnected. They're very large. They're very cumbersome. They don't move very quickly. We spin up big power plants up and down. Camus Energy is been started in order to really try and take modern software and you apply it to this question of like, how do we create grids that are smarter, that communicate downstream with the equipment that's being used to inform it about peak power times, communicate upstream about like when people are going to need to use power, and to overall make the grid operate more efficiently in order to stop wasting energy by having differences between supply and demand. Another big sticking point is aerospace. If people want to be able to fly places, we need to be able to have airplanes that don't emit carbon dioxide. And that's actually quite difficult. This is also actually a storage problem. If you look at the energy density per kilogram of batteries, they top out at about 250 watt hours per kilogram. Jet fuel is extremely energy dense, 12,000 watt hours per kilogram. You light it on fire, it goes boom. The problem is you need to have, if you want to load up that much power into an airplane, it is going to make it very heavy and it won't get off the ground. So there are many companies working on the electrification of flight. Ampere is one that's building more efficient, lighter electric aircraft. And Airbus, which is a major aerospace company, is experimenting with concept vehicle that would use hydrogen. Hydrogen is actually great from a specific energy standpoint. It's very energy dense, but it's extremely difficult to transport and store relative to jet fuel. And so building newer airplanes that are able to use hydrogen that can then be generated by renewable energy, which people call green hydrogen, is an overall goal and a possible way out of that. Getting to even more difficult problems, industrial materials are pretty refractory to having their CO2 reduced. And there's two major categories that I want to talk about. The first is concrete. If you look at the left side of this, one of the main processes involved in making concrete, and by the way, concrete is the most highly used material across the globe per pound. Concrete is really simple to make, and you make it from local ingredients usually. And the conversion of limestone into calcium oxide, lime, it just releases a huge amount of carbon dioxide. And it is responsible for about 5% of global CO2 emissions. And it's just really difficult to solve that problem. There's a lot of chemists working on how do you make greener cement. And it is not a well-solved problem right now. Steel is responsible for something like 7 to 9% of global CO2 emissions. And steel isn't actually particularly unique among industrial processes, just that we use a lot of it. And by the way, I love steel. I'm an artist. I love sculpture. I love working with steel. It is a fascinating material. If you're a material scientist, it is a micro scale amalgam of basically ceramic and metal, which is what makes it light, but also malleable. Steel is a fascinating material. Unfortunately, it requires a huge input of fossil fuels because it is very difficult to get very high temperatures out of electrical processes. And we need very high temperatures for most industrial processes. So figuring out ways to generate steel and other industrial processes like aluminum that require very high temperatures without burning fossil fuels is extremely important and also, again, not a well-solved problem. And so finally, like going on to like probably the most abstruse, high tech stuff are things like carbon capture. On the left, I have a picture of what a lot of people think about when they think about carbon capture, which is direct air capture. And Climeworks is probably one of the biggest companies in this space, where they're basically literally trying to suck carbon dioxide out of the air. And unfortunately, the IPCC assumptions about us getting below 1.5 degrees actually do assume that we are going to need a significant amount of negative emissions technologies, ways to remove carbon dioxide from the air. So as much as we would like to say that we don't need new technologies, at the rate at which we are currently attacking this problem, we are never going to get there unless we have significant advances in negative emissions technologies. Unfortunately, the problem with things like direct air capture is it requires a lot of energy. It's hugely energy expensive to pull that carbon dioxide out of the air that we just put in by burning things. It's just a simple physics entropy problem. And that energy has to be renewable and has to not emit net carbon in order for us to actually be carbon neutral on that process. So it requires a huge input of energy. And then we need to figure out how to store that carbon dioxide. Do we pump it underground? Do we convert it into other things that people need? There's a hugely complicated question. There's a bunch of companies like Charm Industrial also that are working on direct air capture. But there are other ways of doing negative emissions. I want to highlight, of course, our work on methane mitigation. Natural gas is much better for the environment if you burn it in terms of its climate impact versus just like releasing it into the atmosphere, where it has a huge climate impact. It is a fossil fuel. I think eventually we need to get rid of all those fossil fuels, but we're not doing that right now. And by stopping natural gas leaks, we are literally pulling not allowing that carbon, that high impact carbon, to get into the atmosphere, and that gives us a lot of runway in order to work on the other problems we're facing this. And then there's a lot of other negative carbon technologies that are relatively much simpler. Afforestation is the canonical one. Drone Seed is an example company where they're trying to figure out how to make it more efficient to reseed forests that have been burned by wildfires. And there's a lot of energy behind the idea of planting like 1 billion trees or something, I think is one of the slogans. And to be honest, afforestation is great, and it is also somewhat controversial. The problem being that it's a really attractive to be able to say, all we need to do is plant trees. Everybody loves trees. The problem is that trees take a really long time to grow. They actually, relatively speaking, don't pull that much carbon dioxide out of the air. And they don't sequester carbon that well because they can burn down, as we have seen in California. And the risk of wildfire increases as global temperature increases and disaster events increase due to climate extremes. And as a result, afforestation is probably not where we want to put all our eggs in that basket, because the carbon sequestration when a forest burns down goes completely out the window. And so there's definitely going to need to be a mixture of technologies in carbon capture. And unless we want to incur extremely wide-scale suffering, we do need to think about how to do carbon capture. But it's not entirely obvious that there is a silver bullet there. The current technology doesn't really support any one silver bullet. And so it will require more investment and more thought about what the social impacts of each of these kinds of technologies are. So I want to move there from this sort of overview of what some of the most important technologies I think are in addressing climate change to one last big thought about what your role as an engineer or a student who wants to go into engineering is in terms of what to do about these problems. And it's common to think about our personal happiness as being a function of just like, how much happiness our personal life satisfaction as being a function of how much happiness is in our lives. But it's, I think there's been a recent realization in some of the literature around actually the study of human happiness that there's actually like two really orthogonal ways to think about it. And one is what makes you happy, and the other are things that give you meaning. And people tend to need both in order to be truly fulfilled and feel like they are doing well spiritually and emotionally. And and meaning comes to people through a lot of different ways. Religion is a way that many people find meaning. Um, Having kids is a way that a lot of people find meaning. Um, and I think for a lot of people, they would like to find meaning in their work. And so there's a recent book about called Ikigai, and it's a Japanese word. And it really is this idea of like finding that purpose in life. And this is a graphic that I think has become popularized recently that shows like that Ikigai is conceptually the the intersection of what you enjoy doing, what you can get paid to do, what you're good at, and importantly, what the world needs. What is a mission that you can really get behind? And for me personally, climate change is really the intersection of those things as an engineer. Um, and there are a lot of opportunities out there for engineers to get involved. And this is really the root reason why I started CTAN, is because there are a lot of engineers that want to get involved and they want to know where to plug in. And I want to emphasize that it doesn't have to be ground shattering. We have these ideas of like these heroic world changers who, you know, start a company and do everything and fix everything. And really, the world is typically not fixed that way. The world is fixed by a lot of people doing a lifelong labor together to fix those problems. And sometimes those labors seem small and they seem insignificant compared to the scale of the problem. And I know I talked a lot about the scale of the problem, and it can seem really daunting. But I think that if you find something that you love, that you can do, that you're good at, and that is making a difference, it doesn't need to be a huge difference. It just needs to be a difference. And it should be weighted by how much importance there is, which is one of the things I want to talk about. But basically, uh, any difference that you can make is important. And I think that's where I'm done.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon. That was a great talk. We'll just open up the Q&As real quick. We already have a few questions here. The first question that I saw pretty early on was how has Python been used in your work? I think like coding.
Yeah, our Python runs our entire backend. I'm basically like a glorified backend engineer, and we have if you Google Matthew Gordon PyCon climate change, you'll find my talk, which talks about in pretty great detail about some of the systems we built. I'm going to give a talk at Predictive Analytics World next month about our ML stack and how we're using machine learning to automate some of our processes. I'm happy to talk about that in greater detail. It's like I could talk about that forever.
All right. And our next question is, what are your thoughts on using sustainable aviation fuels?
I'm not familiar with any sustainable aviation fuels personally, apart from green hydrogen. I don't know what other fuels the speaker's referring to. I'm happy to let them expound on that. But I think the point is that like any aviation fuel that can be generated that has high energy density that does not generate carbon in the creation of the fuel is a viable alternative. It's not. I'm not super familiar with it.
Yeah, Shweta, if you want to know anything more specific, just drop that here again. And our next question is, how do we update to smart grids? Do we need to update the technology itself, policy, etc.?
That's a good question. It's not. What I will say is that Hal Harvey from Energy Innovations gave a talk in which he talked about this, and one of the things he pointed out is that typically like municipal energy districts that like run these things and decide like who, you know, what the mix of energy is going to be and how the grid's going to get operated and stuff, those tend to be run by a relatively small number of elected and appointed officials. And so the answer is you actually need to put progressive people in those positions. And so those are what he talks about as very high leverage places to focus our energy. So the real answer is you need to get the right people in place. If you look at what happened with the Texas grid over the winter, it was just an absolute disaster run by rampant deregulation. And that is kind of what you want to do, is you want to get people in places like that who understand that climate change is a significant threat to their ability to serve their constituents, and to consider that in the long-term process. And everything else flows from there. The technology is being developed, the interoperability. There's a lot of need for large-scale infrastructure projects. One of the ones that that Hal talks about is building wind farms in like Wyoming that can then power Las Vegas. But that needs long distance, high energy transmission, which is a big capital outlay. So that's, an infrastructure problem that has to happen at the municipal, state, federal level. The Biden administration is plowing a ton of money into this. I'm really excited to see where their priorities are there.
Cool. And we have an update on the aviation fuel question. Sure, this says from biomass and livestock feed.
I am a little skeptical about any fuel proposals that involve that basically compete with the food chain, because I think one of the things that you see with, like, for instance, mixing ethanol into gasoline is it tends to drive up food prices. The fact that it hasn't in this country is due to the fact that we subsidize corn immensely. But that's just a shifting of money from one person to another. And agriculture is difficult to do sustainably. And trying to use agriculture as sort of like, like low, I'm not sure that we're going to be able to sort of generate enough agriculture with zero carbon output, by the way, because agriculture requires machinery, it requires all this stuff at very high scale, that's going to replace aviation fuel. But I haven't studied the question carefully, and I'd be interested to hear more about it at some point.
All right, and our next question again is, what are your thoughts on soil regeneration for carbon sequestration?
I'm not super familiar with it. I have been reading a bit about enhanced weathering, and saw a talk by blanking on the name of the company that's working on enhanced weathering as an approach. There are, I think, broadly speaking, we need to be pursuing a really wide variety of approaches, and we need to be pouring a lot more money and effort into it, but it's high risk. And so it is not entirely obvious that any one of those solutions is going to save us, which is why I think we need a bunch.
All right, and last question we have as of now is, how long do you think it will take until more efficient alternatives to traditional batteries are developed, and how essential do you think these alternatives are?
Man, that is really actually the $1 million question, because if you can do better energy storage, you can basically transition to renewables very quickly. And unfortunately, with batteries, like, it's really just like a physics problem. There are other alternative energy storage schemes that I have read about over the years. Molten salt storage, pumped hydro, where you just pump water uphill, basically. There's even a company called Gravity something, and they were basically like literally like stacking bricks like Legos and like stacking concrete stuff. Flywheels, like carbon fiber flywheels. None of them have the strong, obvious lead right now of being anything close to practical. I think one of the reasons that Bill Gates is pouring so much money into Form Energy right now is that batteries really are kind of the thing we understand the best and that we can scale up. Batteries have a ton of problems, like in terms of the materials that are required. The mining that goes into getting the lithium that we need for batteries is not simple and not necessarily environmentally friendly. I also think it's important to separate out this question of what's environmentally friendly and what is actually affecting climate change. And there is no justice without justice for everyone, and polluting somebody's land in order to build a more viable future through batteries is killing Peter to pay Paul, or robbing Peter to pay Paul, killing, I guess. But and so we do need to consider the social impacts of these things. But I also think it's important to realize that like the scale of human suffering going on is immense, and there's going to be trade-offs.
That's all the questions we have as of now. But I had a quick question. I just want to know if you can talk a little bit more about the methane mitigation work you were doing at Kairos Aerospace, like specify.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. What do I mean, I might even have some slides here. Yeah, actually, I have my slides from my old PyCon talk. Let me see if I can get this up. How much time do I have?
I'm pretty sure we have till 4, so about 12 minutes.
I was curious. The thing beeped me off at like 35 minutes, and I sort of ended a bit abruptly. I thought I had a little more time than that. Let me see. So here are some of my my slides from PyCon. This is a picture of what the Permian Basin in Texas looks like. It is just a pincushion of oil and gas wells, and they are all very far apart from each other. And basically, like, if you want to go figure out which of those are leaking, people put a couple guys in a pickup truck and they drive out to one of them with a handheld gas imaging tool, and they just kind of look around. And if they don't see any leaks, they go home. That's basically like a random inspection process. And the reason is that it's actually really difficult to detect that stuff because it's odorless, colorless. It comes out of the ground, it floats away. And these, there's like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of wells. So the idea is that basically you fly this thing over here and you combine the hyperspectral methane imaging with optical imaging of what's on the ground, and you georectify all of it, and it creates, let's see. Oh, you're seeing my, there we go. It creates an image like that, which is basically like, several passes over that facility showing methane escaping. And what we do is we then pass that information on to the companies that operate those, and they go and fix those leaks. That's like literally product leaking out of the ground, and it's dangerous. And but believe it or not, a lot of oil and gas companies are currently having a lot of investor pressure to reduce their carbon footprint. And to stop leaking methane. Methane is sort of a hot button issue. The Biden administration is currently working on revising some of those rules and fixing some of the Trump era stuff that got rolled back. And so there's a lot of discussion about how best to do that. And we're kind of trying to make the case that sort of these high level surveys are really actually the best way to do that in order to sort of like recover the maximum amount of methane at the minimum cost. Our website, kairosaerospace.com, has like ton of information about that, and I'm happy to send information to anybody else who is looking at that. We're still pretty small. If you consider the fact that like that number of our impact was like 2 million cars, that's a team of like 25 people. And one of the reasons that I am so keen on collective action and technology versus personal choice is like, I could fly around the globe as many times as I want in my lifetime and not cut into the impact that I've made, like personally, in terms of climate change. And that's not a brag. That just means that like you can do so much more if you are willing to, if you sort of invest in technology in smart ways, than you can do just by like washing your clothes on cold water.
Thank you. And we have a couple more questions. How does CTAN help mentor engineers and students? Can you briefly explain the process?
Oh yeah, I'd be happy to. We've been experimenting with a couple different methods. Originally, when I founded CTAN, the idea is we were going to have in-person networking events, and we were going to have people giving talks about technology and helping get people figure out sort of how to navigate that space. And the problem is right now, nobody's doing any in-person events. And so what we wound up doing was reorienting a little bit to having an online mentorship program where we would take applications from people and then we would match them up. One of the things we're doing right now is sort of like re-examining that and figuring out how much of that worked, how much of it didn't work, what did people like about it, what did people not like about it, and trying to sort of like reorient that program towards something that we think is going to bring higher value to people. And one of the things that we're thinking about is having more virtual events until we can get back in rooms with people. One of the types of the events that we've done that was really popular was called Meet the Founder, where we got founders of a couple different companies in online, and they talked about their sort of like journey into climate tech. And there was more than half the time was spent on Q&A in order to give people an opportunity to ask, like, how do I do this? What do I do? Where do I go? The other piece of it is having is really actually doing more person-to-person networking, where we find people whose interests align and then just basically like match them up. I want to sort of automate that process so that we can really expand the scale, because having people apply and then me sort through all the resumes and stuff is actually quite labor intensive. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do now is come up with a mechanism by which we don't have to have a human in the loop. We can actually just have people get an email, once a week or once a month or something that says like, hey, you've been matched with so-and-so, and give those people an opportunity to talk to each other and figure out whether they have things in common that they want to talk about. So they have more connections be made between people.
All right.
But I'm actually interested in hearing from people what they think is important and what would help them as well. So feel free to send me an email, matt@ctan.cc.
Sorry for cutting you out there in the middle.
No, not at all.
There's one more question that we have. Is it possible to change people's opinions about climate change? How do we cause a cultural shift that recognizes both the environmental and social impacts of climate change?
I'm going to recommend that you look up the work of an old grad school friend of mine who now is at Indiana University, and her name is Shazeen Attari, Shaz Attari, Attari. And Shaz studies this for a living. She studies the way in which narrative is an important force in helping people think about climate change and climate impact. She's an expert on this. She disagrees with me to some extent about the role of personal choice. She thinks personal choice is very important. Like I said, I think there's a sliding scale between personal choice and collective action. And so I think that like changing people's minds and opinions is important, but I think that focusing that on sort of their interactions with their community and their government is more important than focusing it on their sort of choice of like whether or not to use LED light bulbs. But Shaz is, I think, one of the people who's done really great quantifiable work on how you change people's opinions.
We actually had one more question in the chat that I noticed. They ask, can that "we can get there right now" slide be made available? I'd like to read more about that.
Yeah,
just add this session will be recorded, so you'll be able to watch this later. But
yeah, trying to see if I can find a copy of it real quick and post the link. I will. Let me do this. I'm going to put in here the short form of our website in the chat here, and my email is matt@ctan.cc, and our full domain is like climatetech.action.network, but ctan.cc is easier to remember. I will if this video is widely available, I will definitely try and put it up on our website, and I will put my slides up on our website so where people can find them easily. And that, I think, will get you that slide and all the other slides.
All right, so we have like 4 more minutes till 4, and I don't see any quick questions. If you have any quick questions, you can drop that right here. Q&A. as like a final question that I had, you talked about reforestation, and the wildfire aspect was something that I never thought about. So like, just want to know if there's like a better, more efficient way to go about it, or it's just like we should just like.
I had actually like a big argument with somebody once about this question of how much energy we should put into afforestation and reforestation, and they were proposing sort of like methods by which we would sort of use solar power to drive irrigation to sort of like make land more arable, and that they thought that this was by far the most cost effective way we could do it. And they did a bunch of back of the envelope calculations, and they were trying to convince like everybody who would listen. And I think it is a fraught topic. I think that like afforestation is one of these things where people want to believe that it's really simple. James Temple, who writes for MIT Technology Review, has written a lot about the complexities of this issue. And I think that if you look up James Temple's work on a billion trees or like planting trees for climate change, he's a great read on this stuff.
All right. I don't see any other questions come up. Do you just want to make any closing remarks in general to people who are interested in sustainability? It's like how to go about it.
Yeah, I guess I would say if you want to look for a job in climate tech, go to climatebase.org. It's run by a friend of mine. And if you haven't already looked at it, it's just a big listing of jobs available across a bunch of engineering disciplines and non-engineering disciplines on climate change. It's a good place to start. There are a number of Slack communities. We have our own Slack, the CTAN Slack. But I would say like New Energy Nexus, Work on Climate is actually really great. Work on Climate is a bunch of like engineers who are sort of trying to figure out how to get involved in climate change. I would go join the Work on Climate Slack really and start poking around and asking people questions. Would look at Climate Base. What I would not do, and I'm just going to say this generically, is I would personally not pay money to join one of these climate fellowships or climate schools or what have you. There's a lot of these floating around. I think that any well-trained engineer should be able to find work doing something viable in climate change. There's not that many opportunities available, which is one of the problems and one of the reasons why I am really trying to figure out how we scale that up. But really like, I don't know that sort of like paying somebody to mentor you through that is like a solution to that problem.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Gordon. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And with that, we're going to wrap up this session. We have other sessions that we'd love for you to check out.
Yeah. I will say the exception to that is you should look at the Clean Energy Leadership Institute, CELI. They have like an excellent program.
Thank you. Yep. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Dr. Gordon.
Yep. My pleasure.